Welcome to Fast History. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most monumental shifts in human history, the agricultural revolution. Diet fads come and go, but one that's really stuck around is the paleo diet. It's all about eating like our Stone Age ancestors, no grains, no dairy, no beans. And it's driven by this belief that humans were actually healthier before farming came along. If that hunter-gatherer life was maybe so good, why did humans basically everywhere eventually ditch it and embrace agriculture? And, well, what were the huge long-term consequences of that?
That's exactly the core of our deep dive today. Understanding this transition isn't just about memorizing dates or places, it's really about grasping that it was anything but simple or uniform or even inevitable. Researchers are still debating the when, the where, the how, and maybe especially its true costs and benefits. So this deep dive should really help you navigate those different perspectives and understand the key impacts that, frankly, still resonate today.
Okay, let's try and unpack this massive shift then. First things first, let's get the basic facts straight. Farming did happen. It became the main way humans lived, but it wasn't some predestined path. So how did this whole thing actually kick off? What was the spark?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is how sort of unintentional its origins seem to have been. Many scholars believe that early plant cultivation, especially over in Southwest Asia, might have been almost accidental. Imagine people in a hunter-gatherer group maybe processing wild grains like wheat or barley near where they were camping. A few seeds are bound to spill, right, onto the ground. Then later, they might notice those spilled seeds are actually growing, maybe even growing better than out in the wild. Perhaps because the ground near their camp was already disturbed or, fertilized by waste. That simple observation, hey, look, stuff grows better right here where we dropped it, repeated over generations, well, that could have slowly led to deliberately scattering seeds and then protecting them. This kind of gradual, often unconscious observation and then replication. That's basically the birth of plant domestication. That's what leads to the agricultural revolution.
Once this process got going, where did it first really take root? And when did it start popping up across the globe?
Yeah. Well, the archaeological evidence, it largely points to Southwest Asia, the region we call the Fertile Crescent. That seems to be the earliest place where agriculture developed independently. We see these settled farming villages emerging from the Neolithic period, that's the New Stone Age, dating back maybe as far as 7500 BC. But here's a really crucial point. Agriculture wasn't like a single invention that then just spread out from one spot across the whole planet. Instead, scholars think it developed independently in several other distinct regions, roughly between, say, 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. Key places like Central America, northern China, New Guinea, they all started domesticating different local crops, maize, millet, taro, things like that.
Right, so multiple starting points. Okay, once farming got going in these initial spots, how did it then spread out and eventually become, the dominant way of life across so much of the world?
Exactly, no. From those early centers, agriculture spread mainly through two key mechanisms. First, you had farmers themselves migrating. They moved into new territories, often bringing their domesticated plants, their animals, their farming techniques with them. It was like a slow but steady wave of expansion. Second, trade networks were really crucial even back then. They helped to move tools, different plant and animal species, and just the invaluable knowledge of how to farm between different groups. It's important to remember, though, this wasn't universal. For example, in most of the Americas, agriculture seems to have developed independently. It wasn't really introduced from Afro-Eurasia until much later.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture now of when and where people started farming and how it gradually spread. But the really revolutionary part isn't just that it happened, right? It's what it fundamentally changed about human society. What were those massive shifts, the ones that went way beyond just how people got their food?
Yes, and this really gets to an important question for understanding world history. The adoption of farming, it absolutely revolutionized human society, like from the ground up. It fundamentally reshaped how communities were organized, how people interacted, their social networks. It had dramatic effects on health and even on population dynamics. It wasn't just a diet change. It was a complete societal overhaul. It really set the stage for everything that followed.
Okay, let's start with communities then. What did settling down actually mean? Instead of constantly moving, how did that change daily life and how people organize themselves?
Well, the shift to settled communities, it was a profound break from literally millennia of human existence. People could now live in fixed locations, often in more permanent houses, the family home, or maybe a larger extended family group. That became the basic unit for producing things, distributing them, consuming them. very different from the fluid, constantly moving hunter-gatherer bands. We see evidence in archaeological sites like Jericho, one of the earliest known walled towns. It gives us powerful evidence of this stability. You see foundations of family homes showing people lived there continuously for thousands of years. As these settled communities grew, and this is crucial, as they started producing a surplus of food, a new social hierarchy inevitably started to form. Suddenly, some individuals or families had more wealth, more food, and because of that, more status. This also led to this growing sense of ownership. Owning land, owning homes, concepts that were largely absent in societies that were always on the move.
And it wasn't just about status, was it? That food surplus also allowed for a division of labor. That seems like a really massive change.
Absolutely, a huge leap. When not everyone had to spend their entire day finding or growing food, people could specialize. This is where we start to see specialized roles emerging. Some people become soldiers, protecting the community. Others become merchants, handling trade. You get craftspeople, honing skills to make pottery, tools, textiles, and critically, you see spiritual leaders, priests, maybe even early kings starting to emerge, managing these increasingly complex societies. Now, this specialization, while it enabled incredible advancements and really laid the foundation for complex societies, it also undeniably sparked new kinds of conflict and deeper inequality. And it's worth noting, too, from a gender perspective, with farming and settled life, women increasingly found their main work focused on raising children and managing the household. That's a significant shift from the often more egalitarian labor divisions you see in many foraging groups.
You mentioned health earlier, and this brings us right back to that paleo diet hook we started with. The paleo argument is that pre-farm humans were healthier. Does the evidence actually back that up for early farmers? What happened to their health?
Yeah, the research on health impacts for early farmers is pretty compelling, and it often really challenges that idealized view. Yes, there were major changes, and often, frankly, for the worse. The repetitive work, often really backbreaking agricultural labor, led to significant physical stress. We see it on bones and muscles and skeletal remains. But maybe the most profound negative impact was the rise of infectious diseases. Domesticated animals started living really close to humans in barns, fields, sometimes even inside homes. This created essentially a perfect breeding ground for pathogens, disease-causing organisms, to jump easily from animals to humans. Think about diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza. Many of these actually originated in domesticated animals. And then you had more people living together in crowded, often less sanitary settled conditions. While these new diseases could transmit incredibly rapidly through the population, this led to much higher death rates from illness compared to the more scattered, mobile hunter-gatherer groups.
Wow, that's a pretty stark picture. And you mentioned networks too. That seems a bit counterintuitive if people are settling down. How do networks change?
Right. Now, here's a truly fascinating, almost paradoxical insight. The agricultural revolution both shrank and expanded human networks at the same time. For your typical farmer in a small, settled village, their daily social and geographic network might actually get smaller. Their world becomes their village. They're staying within a much smaller area than their nomadic ancestors. However, on a larger societal level, networks grew exponentially. That food surplus allowed for specialization, which then demanded trade. So traders and merchants would now connect distant farming communities. They'd facilitate the exchange of goods, ideas, even people between villages, early towns, and eventually these growing empires. So while an individual's immediate world might shrink, the collective human network became vastly more interconnected.
Okay, so farming brought these huge changes. Some benefits, sure, but also significant drawbacks like more inequality, these devastating new diseases. This raises a really crucial question, especially if we think back to that paleo diet idea. Why farm? Why would people seemingly choose to work harder, maybe suffer worse health, and live in a more crowded, unequal community? It doesn't really seem like a straightforward, obvious choice.
It's so easy for us, looking back with our modern understanding, to try and make a pros and cons list, but we have to emphasize, early farmers didn't make a deliberate pro and con choice like we might think about it today. It's way too simplistic to assign clear, single reasons from our vantage point. It was much more gradual, complex, adaptive process.
So what does this all mean for historians then? When they try to piece together the why, what are the main drivers they think were actually at play?
Well, scholars suggest multiple reasons, and they're often interconnected. One really prominent theory centers on environmental response. Think about naturally occurring climate change, like the end of the last ice age. Things got warmer, drier in many places. This significantly altered ecosystems. It dried up areas that used to support lots of wild game and plants. This might have pushed human populations to settle in less dry areas, like river valleys or oases, where farming became not just possible, but maybe even necessary to feed everyone. Another potential factor is population growth itself. And this is a classic chicken or egg scenario for historians. Did farming emerge because a growing population needed a more intensive way to get food?
Yeah.
Or did farming allow for population growth by supporting more people in a smaller area? Scholars are still actively debating which came first, or if it was more of a feedback loop. Hunter-gatherer life could be very feast or famine. Farming, even with its higher labor costs and health issues, offered a generally more reliable, predictable food supply. It reduced that constant threat of starvation. So it wasn't necessarily about getting more food per person, but about getting food more consistently from a fixed place. Less about making life easier, maybe, and more about making it predictable.
Okay, so it sounds like this complex mix. Environmental pressures, population shifts, maybe just a fundamental need for a more reliable food source that gradually push people towards more intensive farming. But the biggest question, the one that really resonates with our initial paleo diet discussion, was it actually better? Was the agricultural revolution really a step forward for humanity?
And this is exactly where we loop back to our initial question about the paleo diet and these broader historical perspectives. This is where the really fierce academic debate lies. Was farming actually better than foraging? The answer, well, it has shifted dramatically over time.
What's so fascinating here is just how much historical opinion has swung back and forth on this. Can you tell us a bit about how that debate has evolved?
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, really right up until the mid-20th century, historians pretty much saw the shift to agriculture as purely positive. It was seen as an unquestionable sign of human progress. The narrative was that humanity was escaping this miserable, dangerous hunter-gatherer life. Farming offered control over nature, a stable food supply, and supposedly the leisure time needed for civilization to blossom. The image was, primitive savagery giving way to enlightened stability. But more recent interdisciplinary research, drawing heavily from anthropology, genetics, archaeology, environmental science, it significantly challenged that sort of triumphal story. Scholars like Jared Diamond, for instance, famously called the adoption of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Strong words.
The worst mistake. Wow, that's a really strong claim. What's the evidence behind that kind of thinking?
Well, the argument for foraging having advantages is quite compelling, especially when you look at it through certain lenses. This research suggests that many foragers might have had a comparatively easy life. They often worked fewer hours than early farmers think, maybe 20 hours a week for subsistence versus, 40, 50, 60 hours of demanding farm labor. Their diet was usually more varied. They ate a wide range of plants and animals, which often meant better nutrition, fewer deficiencies compared to diets that relied heavily on just one or two staple crops like rice or wheat. They also generally had lower rates of infectious disease, mostly because of their mobile lifestyle and smaller group sizes, which limited how diseases spread. Plus, many foraging societies seem to have more social equality, fewer accumulated possessions that could lead to big wealth gaps. And they arguably had more leisure time, which could be spent on socializing, storytelling, art, that sort of thing.
Okay, so on one hand, you have this picture of like healthy, egalitarian foragers with lots of free time. But obviously, we can't just ignore everything agriculture allowed us to build. What's the counter argument? What are farming's advantages, even with all those costs?
Exactly. It's definitely not a simple question, and there are strong counterarguments. Other scholars argue that even with those undeniable problems, more inequality, higher disease rates, often harder work farming was overall profoundly positive. Why? Because it fundamentally allowed for cultural exchange and collective learning on a scale never seen before. Without it, you simply wouldn't have the basic building blocks of what we call human civilization. Think about it. No stable, predictable lives that allow for long-term planning, no writing systems to record knowledge across generations, no complex governments or formal laws, and certainly none of the, monumental achievements of complex societies. The incredible architecture, the great works of literature, sophisticated philosophies, religions, sustained scientific inquiry. You take something like the Ad-Dar Monastery at Petra, that amazing structure carved right out of the rock in Jordan. That level of organized labor, specialized skill, sustained effort, it just wouldn't exist without settled agricultural societies that could support large populations and specialized workers.
So we're really not talking about something being absolutely good or bad here, but more like a really complex series of trade-offs. Both lifestyles had major downsides as well as upsides.
Precisely. And just to counter that sometimes overly rosy picture of foraging, it's important to remember life wasn't always easy or healthy for foragers either. They faced constant threats, higher death rates from accidents, predators, sometimes violent conflicts. They competed for scarce resources, and food wasn't always just there for the taking. Periods of famine, scarcity, those were real possibilities, especially in tougher environments. And while their work might have been less frequent or repetitive, it could often be more difficult or dangerous. Think about hunting large animals. It's also possible they worked less simply because more work wasn't productive beyond immediate needs. You can only gather so much in one spot before it's gone. So, yeah, we now have a much more complete, more nuanced picture. It's not that foragers were entirely miserable or that farmers were suddenly living easy lives. The agricultural revolution completely transformed communities, networks, how things were produced and distributed. It was a truly complex trade off where the quality of life didn't just get better or worse. What people even considered work or needs or wants fundamentally changed.